the briefers were from the US or British embassies who were telling us that the Mujahideen have captured this town and the government has suffered a defeat in that town and they're on the run and the Soviet helicopter's been shot down here and so on. And these briefers were all officials of the Western governments. So everybody knew that this was a fiction and a propaganda and a military war being run by Western governments.
The continued troubles in the Middle East, famine and depression in Africa, genocide in Southeast Asia, the brutal occupation of Afghanistan.
With Margaret Thatcher in Downing Street and Ronald Reagan in the White House, the Cold War with Moscow was hotting up. I have taken the exact speech of Margaret Thatcher from her speech record. In this document she declared, "It is in our own interests, as well as the interests of the people of the region, that they build on their own deep religious tradition." Just what that religious tradition was is best illustrated by the Afghan leaders that Britain and America were arming and funding.
The absolute classic case, the sort of stereotypical case, is the support that the Americans gave the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in order to drive out the Russians, as Brzezinski, one of the sort of dons of US foreign policy, famously said, "What's a few stirred up Muslims compared with the defeat of the Soviet Empire?" Now, of course, after that, we found out exactly what the cost of a few stirred up Muslims was, and the whole root of the strength of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan was a direct result of that American policy of funding them.
In the 1980s, when under the totally immoral policy that my enemy's enemy is my friend, Britain, with the United States obviously as the senior partner, but Britain under Mrs. Thatcher's administration was fully involved in developing what became Al-Qaeda and what became the Taliban. And they did so on the principle that these people were fighting the Russians, or the Soviets to be more precise, and that we would support them.
Britain supplied arms and training to the Mujahideen forces fighting the Russians.
I can tell you that even in Fort William, in the northwest of Scotland, at the military base there of the Royal Marine Commandos, extremists, so-called Mujahideen in the 1980s, received training.
The Taliban were able to use blowpipe anti-aircraft missiles supplied by Britain to the Mujahideen.
These are the famous blowpipe missiles, and then they were overtaken by the American Stinger missiles, which brought, they're man-held, shoulder-held, and can fire at aircraft in the sky.
The British worked with the Americans in a covert program codenamed Operation Cyclone to raise a powerful Takfiri force to fight in Afghanistan against the Soviet occupation.
US National Security Advisor Brzezinski flew to Pakistan to set about rallying resistance.
It is believed Brzezinski, US National Security Advisor to President Jimmy Carter, was behind this operation. Millions of dollars were spent for a decade in the 1980s on training and weaponry to Takfiri groups that later established Al-Qaeda.
On the Afghan border near the Khyber Pass, he urged the soldiers of God to redouble their efforts.
That land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
Al-Qaeda came into existence with the blessing of London and Washington.
The tunnels that bin Laden later used in Tora Bora to hide from the Americans were partly financed by the CIA, because bin Laden had a construction company at that time, and it was also a jihadi, and he was making money and making jihad simultaneously, and the CIA was helping him.
Until 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall, followed 2 years later by the collapse of the Soviet Union, global policy in Washington and London was dictated by the needs of the Cold War. After 1989, that changed. The end of the Cold War was rapidly followed by a series of American-led wars on the Islamic world, beginning with the war which followed the occupation of Kuwait by the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein in 1990.
Less than a week ago, in the early morning hours of August 2nd, Iraqi armed forces, without provocation or warning, invaded a peaceful Kuwait.
The Saudi royal family had been terrified when Saddam's armed forces toppled the royal family of Kuwait, but the Saudi king was happier relying on the United States.
Elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, as well as key units of the United States Air Force, are arriving today to take up defensive positions in Saudi Arabia. I took this action to assist the Saudi Arabian government in the defense of its homeland.
This state, which has been the best friend of US, Britain, or Western interest for decades, since its inception in the 20s of the 20th century, this state has been the main source of fundamentalist propaganda.
A pattern had emerged when Britain and the US saw that when they shared interests in Wahhabis and similar groups such as Al-Qaeda, then they could make alliances. But if these groups opposed their imperial interests, they would quickly turn on them.
IS is indeed a byproduct of Wahhabism. For instance, the anti-Shia sectarianism is one key feature of Wahhabism.
American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
Occupation forces took advantage of the tribal and religious differences in Iraq.
These differences were elevated into hostile conflicts through a process that the occupation itself supervised, because the occupation faced enormous resistance from the people, opposition, so divide and rule became essential to maintaining the occupation. They started either funding, creating secret militias, which try to use violent methods against Shia or against Sunni and so on. It's very common amongst Iraqis. They say the same person who blows up a Shia mosque will go the next day and blow up a Sunni mosque. This has become a current saying in Baghdad itself.
Probably one of the greatest examples of that is the case of two British soldiers dressed up in Arab clothes with false beard and with bombs and ammunition in a car, which were arrested by Iraqi police officer. And they were taken to the police station to be questioned. They refused to answer why they were dressed up in that way. They said that they need to talk to their commanders.
Of course, then British forces then actually took over that prison and freed the SAS soldiers, but actually took a military operation.
You don't need to be a nuclear scientist to recognize that in the height of creating these conflicts between Sunni and Shias, two British soldiers dressed up in that way with bombs and so forth, what else could they have been involved in? And it's very easy for them one day to become a Shia attacking Sunni and another day a Sunni attacking Shias.
The British were very keen really not to pursue this matter. So here we have, they were encouraging the militias, they then got involved in a battle with them, there were some people killed, and yet they keep quiet. But how do we explain that?
Well, of course, it's not really reported in this country because it appears that what's known as a D-notice has been issued, where the media are told not to speak about something, and often they will comply. These can be put down by the police and by the security services, and it seems in this case they may well be complying with this.
In 2014, Iraq was torn apart by the rise of ISIL, when whole swaths of western Iraq fell under its control. Elsewhere is the history of MI6. Author Stephen Doyle quotes from a Foreign Office document written in 1993. The document is titled Islamic Fundamentalism in the Middle East, and it notes,
private Saudi and Gulf money donated for Islamic causes is a common factor in much of the region.
Saudi Arabia has been funding the extremist form of Islam, which is deeply opposed to other forms of Islam, and as well as the West, and it really is playing a very game. They might think that Saudi Arabia is on the West side. Saudi Arabia is on its side.
London was well aware money was flowing into the coffers of bin Laden from the elite of Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf states. Further light on the relationship between Britain and America on the one hand and Al-Qaeda on the other is shown by Christopher Andrew in his book The Defense of the Realm, the authorized history of MI6. He notes that in the 1990s, while Britain and America were aware that Al-Qaeda was waging war on them, bin Laden was a guest in London.
Andrew writes, yet bin Laden stayed in London in 1994, setting up an office in Wembley. He returned regularly in 1995 and 1996 using a private jet.
The fact that London had become a place of refuge for many Wahhabis and Salafists had become a cause for concern among Britain's allies. Many believe that Britain was prepared to accommodate them under tight surveillance because they were useful tools. For instance, in trying to topple Gaddafi in Libya, a number of these people claimed they had an agreement with the security forces that they could do whatever they wished as long as they did not create instability or unrest in the United Kingdom itself. Howard Al-Fawaz, head of bin Laden's London office in the mid-1990s, told us